Hey, everybody, welcome to the Michael Steele Podcast. I'm joined today by political consultant and activist Julie Roginsky. She is a former contributor at CNBC and the Fox News Channel. In 2017, she became one of the most notorious women at Fox, if you will, because she became one of the first women to file a sexual harassment and retaliation lawsuit against the Fox News Channel and its chairman at the time. Since then, she has fought relentlessly against non-disclosure agreements and other tools that organizations use to silence women from publicly disclosing their experiences with toxic work environments. She is the host of the new podcast, Retaliation with Julie Roginsky, which shares the experiences of brave individuals who have been castigated rather than celebrated for standing up against workplace toxicity. She's also one of the founders of Lift Our Voices, which again is a nonprofit to help women in this space navigate successfully the challenges that they face with harassment. Stay tuned for a great conversation with Julie Roginsky coming up next on the Michael Steele Podcast right after this. All right, everybody, welcome to the podcast. It's always a pleasure when you drop in, and we've got a great guest to have a conversation with today. As I noted in the opening, she's done a phenomenal amount of work in a space that is often overlooked. A lot of people don't pay attention, but it is vitally important. And that is bringing activism to this area where, Julie, you have a chance to provide a voice for a lot of women out there in the workplace that tend to be somewhat toxic environments, as you recall from your days at Fox. Walk us through the work you're doing right now and help us understand, certainly legislatively and otherwise, where you're beginning to see some turning of the corner, as it were.
Well, first of all, Chairman, thank you so much for having me. And it's great to talk to you again. We were just reminiscing off camera about both of our times at Fox News, which we're both very much removed from now. But to bring it back to Fox News, my colleague Gretchen Carlson, who you know was the former host of Fox and Friends, among other shows at the network, sued Roger Ailes in 2016, a full 18 months before what we now know is the start of the Me Too movement, or what's marked as the start of the Me Too movement, for sexual harassment and retaliation. And that really was a very seminal moment, not just for those of us who were still working at Fox, as I was, but also just for women all across the board. I mean, you had really huge trailblazers like Tarana Burke, mother of the Me Too movement, who'd started this conversation a decade prior, but it really exploded. And I'm sorry to say this because it really should have exploded with Tarana Burke in the way that it did a decade later, but it really exploded when some highly prominent women like Gretchen came forward. And then obviously the Harvey Weinstein survivors, which does not discount at all the really yeoman's work that a lot of women, including Tarana, did in the decade prior. But when that happened, it gave me and a lot of other women the thought that, oh my God, maybe we shouldn't just take what's happening to us quietly. And maybe this is an opportunity for some of us to speak up. And so about 10 months after she filed her lawsuit, I filed mine as well. What ended up happening is we both ended up suing. We both ended up settling. We both got very stringent NDAs as a result of our settlement, which means we can't talk about anything that happened at Fox News with Roger Ailes or so on and so forth. What ended up happening is that when our cases came to the fore publicly, so many women started contacting us, and not women in high profile roles, but women from across the board who said, yeah, this has been happening to me as well, but we can't talk about it because we're either bound by these very stringent non-disclosure agreements or we're bound by forced arbitration, which means effectively that if you go to HR and you say, hey, I'm being harassed or I'm being discriminated against or so on, you're immediately shunted into the secret chamber of forced arbitration, never to be heard from again.
Right.
Can't bring a public lawsuit. Nobody knows what happened to you. And I can tell you from my experience at Fox, so many women I worked with would just disappear one day, and you would think, well, what happened to them? And the kind of the narrative was, oh, the ratings weren't that good. You've been in TV, you know, the ratings
Yeah.
aren't that good, not that great. Well, lo and behold, it turns out a lot of them complained about Bill O'Reilly, and basically lost their jobs as a result, just for doing nothing more than saying, hey, I was sexually harassed by Bill O'Reilly. So when that happened, you understand that people just tend to disappear. Not only do they get driven out of their jobs, but they're really their chosen careers as a result of what's going on. We looked around and we said, you know, nobody's really laser focused on this issue. And it's not just about women, it's about people of color, it's about members of the LGBTQ community, really anybody who's really been marginalized in society at large, but also at work, because obviously the two are go hand in hand. And so we said, well, what the hell? Nobody else is doing this. So we might, I think if we knew then what we know now, we probably wouldn't have been so like, let's start a nonprofit. What can
Right, right.
but you know, we started this nonprofit about 3 years ago, really having no nonprofit experience, and really had to learn and kind of fly by the seat of our pants. And it's been incredibly rewarding. First of all, a huge privilege to be able to be doing this stuff, but also fairly really successful in ways that we didn't know was going to happen this quickly. We thought this would be a very long slog. But the reality is, even before we launched this nonprofit, Gretchen had started talking about forced arbitration on the Hill. And as you know, it's almost impossible to get anything done there. But
Right.
she was able to really get, because arbitration was really her baby, to get Lindsey, here's some strange bedfellows, Lindsey Graham and Kirsten Gillibrand to partner up and sponsor this forced arbitration bill that would effectively ban forced arbitration for sexual harassment and sexual assault. We wanted it to go further. We wanted it to go to apply to racial discrimination and all other forms of discrimination, gender discrimination. But there's only so much you could do with one of the two parties. So we could only get sexual harassment and assault, which is still huge. And that was signed by President Biden. We were at the White House in March, which was amazing. We immediately said, well, that's great. It's a great start, but it's not enough. So we also want to do the same for NDAs, make sure that we cannot silence women who've been sexually harassed or assaulted in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And again, so happy to say that about 10 days ago or so, the Senate unanimously, after a lot of work, passed the Speak Out Act, which means that effectively, once the House comes back into session after the election, hopefully the House will pass it as well. And then you will not be able to be silenced no matter where you work with an NDA for sexual harassment and assault. But we're going to keep going. We're not stopping.
Yeah, no, there's just so much that you've laid on the table just in this opening part of the conversation for folks to understand and to get into. And we'll get to some of the specifics of the Ending Enforced Arbitration of Sexual Assault Act, as well as the Speak Out Act. But I want to go back to a little bit of the culture, because I think it's important for a lot of people to appreciate and understand what culture in a work environment, in a community space, wherever women in particular, but as you said, people of color, LGBTQ happen to be, there's a culture that grows up that forces silence and enforces silence. You noted at one point that you felt very isolated at Fox when this was happening to you, that there was no one you could talk to. And then when your colleague, Gretchen, says, wait a minute, hold up, I've had it. Your first response was, oh, you mean there's someone else? I'm not alone? A lot of that culture creates this thing that this has only happened to you. And so if you say anything, and that goes back to what you were saying, how they could just shift people out. Just, well, you lose your job because you're upsetting the culture. Talk to us a little bit about how that is allowed up to now, because these laws will apparently change some of that, hopefully a lot of that. How was that allowed to fester and trap so many women and create an environment in which they were effectively silenced because they had nowhere to go?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon. And if you look at the history of it, it's a really interesting phenomenon because enforced arbitration and NDAs really go hand in hand. They're both silencing mechanisms, so I'll use both of them interchangeably to answer your question. In 1992, only about 2% of all American workers were bound by forced arbitration, and very few were bound by NDAs. NDAs have been traditionally used, as they should be, to protect proprietary information, right? If you know the secret formula of Coca-Cola, you shouldn't walk across the street to Pepsi and give it to them. No question, that should be protected. And then in 1992, it started to kind of rise. And by 2024, 84% of all American workers will be bound by forced arbitration. That means they can't. Picture this. You go to HR because you've been racially discriminated against, and you raised your hand and you say, I'm Michael Steele, and my boss is discriminating against me because I'm a Black man. HR will take a look at your contract and they'll say, okay, but you have an arbitration clause in your contract. Don't worry about it. We'll settle this very quietly. Nobody will even know about it. It's all very top secret. You don't have to worry about any infringement on your reputation. And you say, okay, I have no choice. I'm bound by this contract, so there's no choice. And what they don't tell you is that the list of arbitrators they give you to choose from is a list that they've used repeatedly in the past.
Sure.
So the arbitrator has no question a vested interest in ruling on behalf of the company because it's a really lucrative position. And what's more is that they don't also tell you that the arbitrator typically is a retired lawyer, retired judge. It's typically an older white man who looks nothing like the woman or the person of color whose cases they're adjudicating. It's not a jury of your peers, let's put it that way. And so it's no surprise of all cases that can go to arbitration, only 2% do, because of all the cases that do, and only 2% do, only 2.5% result in any kind of financial compensation for the complainant, which means that you are probably most likely going to lose your job as a result of any kind of settlement you get or just going through arbitration. You probably will be forced to sign an NDA if you don't already have one at the point of employment, which most people, a third of American workers do. And when you apply for your next job and somebody says, well, why'd you leave the job where you worked for the last 10 years? Your answer is, I can't tell you. Well, would you hire anybody if they said, I can't tell you? Pretty much. No, of course not. This person must have done something wrong. So, but what happened in 1992 was very interesting because if you think about the trajectory where very few people were bound by these silencing mechanisms, and today most people are, what happened? Well, Anita Hill happened.
Mm-hmm.
And here's this woman, if you want to talk about we talked about Tarana Burke, but really the mother of all of this was Anita Hill.
Anita Hill, right.
She came forward, she raised her hand and she said, listen, I was sexually harassed by Clarence Thomas and went through hell. A lot of people, as you remember, you were in politics back then, so was I, but we were old enough to remember that was the year of the woman the following year, and all these people were elected to office in 1992 as a result of this, all these women. But the other lesson that was learned by companies. And they said, oh my God, we cannot afford to have an Anita Hill here. We cannot afford to have somebody come forward and raise her hand and say that she was harassed. So we're going to do everything we can to prevent an Anita Hill in our life from impacting us the way that she impacted Clarence Thomas. And that's when these silencing mechanisms started really taking off. And so in the last 30 years, and it's been 30 years, which is hard to believe since Anita Hill, what's happened is that you've had this epidemic of silencing where people no longer are able to raise their hand and say, I was harassed or I was discriminated against, or I have a disability and somebody didn't give me an opportunity. I mean, violations of Title VII laws are happening every single day.
Do you feel at some point, or did you feel at some point, I mean, because clearly you and Carlson decided, screw it, right?
We haven't decided screw it because we can't talk about what happened to us.
True. So that's what I want to get to. What happens if you do?
Even telling you that is a violation of my NDA. I mean,
come on, seriously? What?
Yes,
how the hell does that happen?
Well, I'll give you an example.
Let me just break it down a little bit more for you. So if you said, you know what, this is what this is all about, and you just broke it down, what did they come and take the money back from you, or the settlement, or do they put you in jail? Do they, hijack your car? Do they keep your kids from going to college? I mean, this is the part I guess for someone like me, who tends to just want to be the bull in the china shop because that's what china shops are for, right?
Not to look at the pretty porcelain. You're right. Okay.
Right. I mean, so
Right.
is that part of the system? That's the whole design of the system, is to just make it just like the threat, the sword of Damocles over your head constantly. That if you even think about this NDA, if you even think about this conversation in our settlement, we're coming after you. And there's a part of my brain that goes, all right, motherfucker, come on, bring it. But then I guess the other side that you're going to explain to me why you don't.
I'll explain this. So I'll give you an example that I can talk about. So I've actually, to show you how bipartisan or nonpartisan this issue is, right? Everybody thinks, okay, Fox News, Republican, conservative, fine. But I was bound by 2 NDAs in my life. One was as a result of settlement with Fox News.
Right.
Other was as a result of employment. I'm a political consultant in my real life, and I've consulted for a lot of different people, one of whom is Phil Murphy, now the governor of New Jersey, who's a Democrat.
Right.
On the very first day of my consulting agreement with Phil Murphy, I got a very long contract, and you used to run the RNC, so you know what these contracts look like. They're very long, sometimes very onerous, especially for senior consultants. And buried in this contract was a clause that basically said I could not discuss anything that ever happened or I witnessed on his campaign at any time with anybody whatsoever, effectively in perpetuity. Well, I looked at it. I didn't really think much about it. I'd signed a billion of these contracts in the past. I thought, okay, of course, things should be proprietary, like polling information, like strategy, all the stuff that, of course, on campaigns should be proprietary. Right. Of course, if somebody wants me to sign a contract to say I'll never leak a poll, no problem. Didn't think much of it. Shortly after, and that election was in 2017, I filed my lawsuit against Fox in April of 17. Shortly after I filed my lawsuit, a bunch of very young women on the campaign, and I was in my 40s at that point already, so I was kind of the senior woman there. A bunch of young women who were just starting out approached me and basically said, we didn't really think we could talk to you about this because you're kind of always in the back room with the guys, but we want to tell you there's some really horrible, toxic stuff happening on this campaign. And I said, okay, that's really awful. Tell me more. So they did. I told now Governor Murphy about that, and I was fired within 48 hours. Never in my life been fired from any job. I mean, this is just unheard of, right? And then immediately told by his attorneys, reminded that I signed this NDA and that I could not discuss any of this with anybody whatsoever. A year later, and I kept to that agreement, a year later, a young woman called me up and said that she had been sexually assaulted by somebody on his, a high-ranking staffer on his campaign. And could I help her? And the reality is I couldn't have helped her, because I couldn't tell her anything. I couldn't tell her about my conversation with the governor. I couldn't have told her about any of the other stuff that I had tried to do to help women there. And it was probably one of the most heartbreaking episodes of my life, because here was a sexual assault survivor, a woman in tears calling me, begging for help, and I could not help her because I was repeatedly threatened with horrible repercussions from his lawyers if I were to violate that NDA. The only reason I'm able to tell you this story now is because ultimately the pressure on him, on the governor, got to be so vast that he had to release me from my NDA. But it took years. And in fact, New Jersey was the first state in the nation to pass a ban on NDAs. He signed that legislation, but it wasn't retroactive. So he still kept me to my NDA even after he signed it.
Right.
And so what I tell you now is, to answer your Fox question, which I can't, is that the repercussions for me would have been, had I violated my NDA and just went public with everything that I knew on that campaign at the time. I don't know what the repercussions could have been. I know that there was literally, I don't know how many emails and how many letters from his attorneys threatening me with legal action if I were to violate my NDA. And what that means is he himself, Governor Murphy, is a former Goldman Sachs executive managing partner. He's worth a tremendous amount of money. Obviously, the campaign and his political entities have much more money than I ever could. Would they have tied me up in court for years just to prove a point, just to make me go bankrupt? Maybe. I just don't know the answer to that.
So that really does speaks to the disadvantage that particularly women have, because you are not necessarily going to be in the financial position on the other side of this to withstand the onslaught of lawsuits coming your way. But here's the flip side of that script. He's a politician. He's a public figure. He's a candidate or a sitting governor. So the playing field does change a little bit when you're like, well, okay, you can sue me and you may bankrupt me, but I guarantee you will never either fill out the rest of your term or hold elective office again. So it becomes this kind of interesting balancing, a power balancing act for people in those positions on campaigns in big networks like Fox. And I guess this must have been part of the thinking for Carlson and ultimately you, not to think for you, obviously, in this case, because you know how you came to the conclusion to ultimately file that lawsuit, given everything else that was going on and the inside pressure you were feeling. There has to be, or I suspect, maybe I'm wrong, a breaking point where you just go, I can't carry this any longer. And I have to find a lane to get on where I can at least begin to fight back. And so now you're at a position where you and Gretchen have put on the table federal legislation that will change the game going forward. But you're really kind of, the Statue of Liberty, if you will, in the harbor with the light overhead saying this way. Give me your tired and your downtrodden in the workforce who are otherwise abused by men and institutions that are holding them hostage to these NDAs, et cetera.
We are, but don't forget, we are not necessarily representative. And look, it's an immense privilege to, as you say, be the people leading this fight, or one of the two of the people leading this fight. But we are, look, you shouldn't shed a tear for Gretchen Carlson or Julie Roginsky, right?
Right.
Both of us are privileged to have done well in life. We are fine. If you look at forced arbitration, 65% of all workers making $13 or less an hour are bound by forced arbitration. Nearly 60% of all African-American workers are bound by forced arbitration, many more women than men. And the home healthcare industry is the industry, no question,
right,
employing mostly women, that is most affected by this. So the typical woman is not me sitting in my apartment in New York. The typical woman is a Black woman cleaning bedpans, making $13 or less an hour. And you ask, yes, did I have leverage with Governor Murphy? Yeah, of course I did. You want to sue me? And I'm going to, which is why I'm able to talk to you about this now. You want to sue me? And we'll go public and then we'll see how this works for you. But the woman cleaning bedpans, making $13 or less an hour, what leverage does she have, right? What possibly, what could she say? That I heard from a woman, this is an awful story, but I heard from a woman a couple of years ago, bound by an NDA. She worked for down south for a big kind of a multinational big box store. She got pregnant. Her boss told her, I don't want any fat women around, so you're fired, which of course is against the law. And said to her, but I'll give you a month's severance. She's a single mom, or about to be a single mom, making minimum wage or slightly above, getting a month's severance in exchange for an NDA and declining to sue. She took it. Of course she took it. Yeah. She had a choice, right? She needed the cash. She had a baby on the way. But what leverage does that woman have? And especially if as you probably do, some of these settlement agreements have a no rehire provision. So that you can apply for a job, which of course, what did you do wrong that you can't apply for a job again at the same company where you worked for so many years? But if you work for a big box store in some town down south, and that's the biggest employer in town, and now you can't apply for a job there again, all because you got discriminated against or harassed, where are you going to work?
Right.
You have to pack up and move maybe 70, 80 miles away to get a job at the next big box store. So I don't know how much leverage, as I said, yes, I had tremendous leverage with Governor Murphy, no question. Do we have leverage with Fox? I guess, but to the extent that Fox even cares about its reputation at this point. But do those women, does that Black woman making $13 or less an hour cleaning bedpans, does she have any leverage?
Right.
Probably not.
Probably not.
But what's awful about this is it shouldn't be, right? It shouldn't be this way. And so many companies spend millions upon millions of dollars on DEI, that's the big, sexy thing now, DEI programs and ESG programs. And we're going to be more mindful of, in light of Black Lives Matter, in light of Me Too, we're going to be so much more mindful of how we treat our employees. And they have all these, everybody wears Black Lives Matter pins, or they wear these, Me Too shirts, whatever it is. But the reality is, as long as you silence your workers, you're really not walking the walk. Because if you're silencing your workers, they can't raise their hand and say, hey, by the way, this company that's making this big deal about how much they're spending on DEI is treating their employees like shit.
Right.
You can't say that.
Right. So before we take a quick break, I want to wrap back in now that we have a fuller picture of your narrative and the storyline over the last 4 or 5 years since this began. The pieces of legislation that you have been a force behind in getting through Congress, now awaiting signature in the passage in the House, the Speak Out Act, which targets specifically NDAs that employees sign when they get hired, and of course the Ending Enforced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act, which eliminates forced arbitration in sexual harassment and assault cases. What does that mean for the future? What does that mean for those currently in this NDA space? Is there a retroactivity to it? What do they just stuck with what they got? What does the landscape look like now that these are law or will become law?
So what this means for forced arbitration is, if you have not already initiated a lawsuit, it is retroactive in the sense that if you have been harassed or assaulted, your employer no longer can force you into arbitration. You can choose to go into arbitration. I highly recommend you don't choose to do that, but you can choose to go into arbitration, but they can't force you into it. The thing to note here is there's nothing in the law that tells the employer that they must tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to know that. So a lot of what we do at Lift Our Voices at our organization is actually a lot of education. And we want employees to know, workers to know, that they do not have to go into arbitration if they've been harassed or assaulted.
Why wouldn't something like that be put in the law? Why is that the institution sort of protecting themselves so we'll keep our population of employees ignorant about what this law actually gives them rights to do?
This was a very long slog passing this legislation, and as you know, a lot of things have to fall by the wayside that you might want in there. As I said, we wanted everything in there, not just harassment or assault. We desperately wanted racial discrimination in there.
Right.
As I said, this does impact women of color much more so than anybody else. But you need 10 votes in the Senate to overcome a filibuster, and we got what we could. It will be back for more, obviously. But the reality is that employers are now in a weird situation, right? Because let's say that you and I are sitting in cubicles next to each other, and I get sexually harassed, but you get racially discriminated against. I now can go file a lawsuit against the same person doing that to both of us in open court. You still have to go to the secret chamber of forced arbitration. It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
At some point, you're creating a dual class system, one for survivors of harassment and assault and one for everybody else. And it's just not sustainable. In terms of NDAs, again, this is not yet law. We still have to get it through the House, but if the law passes as it did in the Senate, what it would effectively do is get rid of pre-dispute NDAs. And the question is, where does this dispute begin? We wanted it to get rid of NDAs for everything, not proprietary information, but from start to finish. But what we negotiated was just pre-dispute NDAs, which means that if you were harassed or assaulted, before there is a dispute, whether it's a legal dispute or however you want to term it, however the courts ultimately decide to term it, then you can speak up. Now, the question is, where does the dispute begin? Does it begin the minute you harass me, or does it begin when I go to HR, or does it begin when I file a lawsuit? We think it begins when you file a lawsuit. We'd like it to begin as late as possible, but that's up to the courts ultimately to decide.
So we're at least getting some parts of the loaf.
Loaf. I will say at the state level, and you're a former state official, so you know this better than anybody. the state level is where the magic really happens.
That's it. Yeah.
And so what we were able to do is get legislation in New Jersey that bans NDAs for all toxic workplace issues. In California, a woman named Fomo Zama, who was a former executive at Pinterest, is an incredible, dynamic woman, got legislation through in California called the Silence No More Act that effectively bans NDAs for sexual, not for everything. I'm sorry, not just sexual harassment, assault, for everything. You know, start to finish. And Washington State also just passed legislation called the Silence No More Act. So just to give you an example of how the state laws impact globally, Microsoft, the minute the Washington law passed, because obviously they're based in Washington State, got rid of NDAs for all their workers globally. So that's why the states are so important. Just because you don't work in Redmond, Washington for Microsoft,
right,
most workers probably don't, doesn't mean that this law in Washington doesn't impact you. Same with Apple. Once it passed in California, Apple got rid of NDAs for all their workers in compliance with the California law, no matter where they work. We're about to introduce legislation. We did it last session. We're about to reintroduce it in New York. As we all know, New York has a little bit of a toxic problem with Wall Street.
Yep, just a little bit.
Yeah, so we're hoping once it passes in New York, between New York, New Jersey, California, and Washington, there's so many companies are domiciled in those states that once they get rid of it for workers in those states, they'll have to get rid of it for their workers around the country.
Well, I appreciate your voice and leadership in this space. I know it's been a very personal and difficult struggle to get to this stage, but there are a lot of folks out there that are going to benefit, however large or small, from your work and the work of Gretchen Carlson, for you guys standing up and standing out on this. So I appreciate it. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to do a little politics when we come back. I heard you know a little bit about that. So
tiny bit.
We're going to have more with our friend and guest, Julie Roginsky, right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the Michael Steele Podcast. We're having an important discussion in the last little bit with Julie Roginsky, who has been in the forefront of opening up and getting behind the veils and the curtains that NDAs represent in the lives of so many workers out there who are harassed and sexually discriminated against, racially discriminated against, and just important work. And so I, as I said before we went to break, thank you for that effort. I want to dirty our hands a little bit and get into some politics because we are 3 weeks out from major election, and really a lot of what we've been talking about kind of feeds into this narrative a little bit when you talk about how state legislatures now are responding to the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade, and how women are responding, how they're reacting to this assault on their rights to make decisions that can protect their health and the health of their unborn child in some respects. How are you assessing the political landscape right now, particularly given the number of women who are running for office in this cycle, a significant number of African American women in particular? How does all of this kind of come full circle, if it does, for you?
You know, it's interesting because if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said typically social issues just don't make a difference as much as I think my party wishes they did.
Mm-hmm.
They typically don't. I sat through some focus groups about a year ago, maybe about 18 months ago now, and it was very, especially with primary Democratic voters, very fascinating because, as you know, you've sat through focus groups as well. You segment them typically by gender and by race and maybe by education level.
Right.
So the only people who had time to really be able to worry about social issues were college educated white voters. Nobody else really had time to worry about that. Everybody else, and especially Latino voters, it was very fascinating. We're incredibly focused on what have you done for me lately, kind of like, are my potholes fixed? Is my small business thriving? Are my taxes, am I paying too much in taxes? And these are primary Democratic voters. We're not even talking about anybody else. The people you think would be most kind of into this. but and same thing with everybody else. You know, you talk to non-college educated voters of any race, or to African American voters, and their attitude was, there are emergent matters now that affect me, right? It's really like, I call it the Janet Jackson model. It's, what have you done for me lately? And nobody else has time to sit around thinking about somebody getting an abortion or not getting an abortion. The only people who do are people who have the financial luxury, or maybe the luxury of age, to worry about, sit back and worry about that happening. So if you had asked me 6 months ago, before Roe got overturned, I would have said, even if Roe gets overturned, I still don't think it's going to make that much of an impact. I'm not so sure now. But I'm still not prepared to say that it's going to be a decisive factor.
Right.
There are things that I think are more decisive. Do I think that there are a bunch of pissed off women out there in the suburbs? I do, but are they as pissed off about this as they are about how much it costs to fill up their gas tank? I just don't know. And again, you know, sometimes I think both parties do this tremendously, but I'll speak for my own party. I think sometimes we so desperately wish that people cared about the issues that we want them to care about, that we kind of overplay our hand there, and remains to be seen. I mean, I may be totally wrong, and maybe that this whole thing will be Roe-vember, as people call it, and it comes down to Roe, but I just don't know.
Yeah, no, you actually touch on a number of very important aspects of this. I've kind of, I've sat in on a couple of focus groups, follow a number of the more responsible and level-headed folks in this space who are not trying to further a political or partisan agenda. They really, hey, this is what people are actually thinking out here in America. You need to pay attention. And I've concluded that I think the Democrats are in a better position than conventional wisdom would tell them or would say at this point. I think they have the opportunity to hold the House, surprisingly. I'm one of a very, very small group of us who either have found some really good marijuana or just have a different political instinct about this. And I tend to think it's the latter, since I don't do the former.
Have you equalized that stuff in Maryland yet? Or are you still?
Yeah, we're working on that. We're working on it. That's on the ballot this November. But I think there is something there. I think the Roe decision, while again to your point not dispositive, has become sort of that piece of thread that ties a lot more together than people may believe. I think voters have, for most part, bifurcated themselves. They feel this way about Joe Biden. They feel a certain way about the economy. But then the democracy issue, the impact of the Supreme Court, these other things now weigh. And recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll came out, I believe, last Friday. 37% of Americans said, yep, the economy, right? That's number one. But you know what number two was? Democracy. 27%. That was not the case, to your point, 6 months ago. So you can see that there's something that's now flowing through the veins of voters when it comes to how they're assessing the election, where these types of decisions aren't necessarily going to boil down, as Republicans want, solely on the economics. Oh yeah, I'm concerned about health, the price of gas and inflation. But then that white suburban Republican woman is saying, yeah, but you're going to take away my daughter's access to a choice she may have to make down the road. That bothers me too. What kind of world are you creating for my daughter? What kind of world are you creating for my granddaughter? And I think the party, Republican, my party is overlooking that, and they're discounting that. And I give you Kansas. No one saw Kansas coming and playing out the way they did. And I think that's a tell that we may see repeated in November.
I think you're right. I mean, Kansas to me was a referendum on the particular issue, right? It was a specific yes or no on abortion itself. The question for me, and this is something that I think you can't really quantify, so I'd be curious to see, again, focus groups on this that I haven't seen, but whether this view on abortion, which has become sort of extreme, right? It's not just getting rid of abortion in the third trimester, or even after 20 weeks, which I think some people not some people, a lot of people might get behind. But it's getting rid, it's criminalizing abortion for the woman. It's criminalizing abortion for the doctor. It's banning abortion from basically day one. It's rape and incest. It's forcing a 10-year-old girl to cross state lines to get an abortion. And what's interesting to me is how that ties into this general sense of extremism that voters might have about the Republican Party with January 6th.
Right.
With other, the assault on democracy generally. Some of these candidates who are running, who are just, I mean, you look at Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, who are just insane.
Right.
And when you look at all of that and you combine all of that, whether abortion is just one part of that piece, right? Because I think the problem with abortion typically is that people don't sit around people wake up every single day wondering how they're going to pay the mortgage. They're going to wake up every single day.
Exactly.
The gas tank. They don't sit around every single day worrying about whether they or their daughter is going to be able to get an abortion until they actually need one, right? But it's not a daily struggle that people have. And so I'm curious as to whether abortion fits more into the larger piece of just this level of extremism, or whether even on its own, people are incensed enough about it. People, look, I'm almost 50 years old. People my age, who are not planning on having any more kids or else, but are thinking about their daughters or their sons or whoever else, whether that's enough to motivate somebody to go to the polls. And I'm not convinced that in and of itself it is, because I don't think it's a daily pressing concern for people the way that the economy is.
You've done a great deal of work in elevating the role of women in politics. You have tried to create some lanes for that to happen. What still needs to happen in your view, particularly as you're looking at the landscape going into November and the number of women who are participating as candidates, the number of women who are playing the roles that you play as a consultant and advisor to candidates? How do you see that sort of creating an equalization, if you will, inside politics? You know, one thing in my many years that I would always complain about is I would go into these rooms and I'd be the only brother in there. In fact, I was just literally at an event, at a meeting last week in which I was literally not only the only brother, but the only, they're all men. So it was me and a whole bunch of white men. And one of the questions was like, where are the women? There are a lot of women who do what we're talking about. Why aren't they in the room? So we still see that as a barrier in so many respects, but you're finding ways to cut through that. What's your assessment of how to further that opportunity and encourage women to more fully participate in the political process?
So I'll tell you, it's a great question, because when I was first starting out, the first statewide campaign I ever did, and I was obviously I was 23, 24, very low level. It was about equal, 50% men, 50% women. And then almost imperceptibly, as the years ticked by, and that was almost 30 years ago now, as the years ticked by, I started looking around and I started noticing I was literally the only woman left in the back room, right? As you say, like where it happens, in the room where it happens. And I started to really wonder why. And I used to teach, there's something called the Women's Campaign School up at Yale. And I used to be on the board there. I used to teach a class there every year. So it's all women, or it was when I was there. And every year, some woman raise her hand and start telling horrible stories about something that happened to her, either as a candidate on the campaign trail or as a staffer or as an operative. And she would start crying. And every year I kind of roll my eyes and I think, okay, you know what? There's no crying in politics. Just suck it up. So somebody harassed you. So somebody said something mean to you. So somebody treated you poorly because you're a woman. Suck it up. As I'm sure you probably had to as black guys, right? Suck it up, just keep your head down, and just you'll get through it, and that's how you climb the ladder. And literally, that was the advice I gave to women for 20 years, and it was the worst piece of advice. I mean, I am so sorry. I feel like I should be on this like mea culpa tour of just apologizing to these women, because it was the worst advice possible. They shouldn't have to suck it up. the guys should cut it out.
Right.
and, and the problem is, I use the example of Governor Murphy. That was the first time and I was really senior. I mean, I was incredible.
Right.
I made the guy governor effectively. If I could get fired for that, what lesson does that show younger women who immediately, when they saw that happening to me, clamped up? I mean, I had a group of them in my house a few months later crying and saying to me, if this happened to you, we can't say there. I mean, and the sad part is 60% of them, if not more, have already left. And that was in 2017. They just don't want to be in the business anymore. So what's the message? What's the message to women, especially to younger women, when you see that no matter how far you get and how high you are, if you are a woman and you raise your hand and you say, I don't want to do this anymore, what's the message to, listen, I'm going to say as much about Fox as I can, but what's the message to women when anybody who's filed a lawsuit against Fox News no longer works there?
Yeah.
Is it their choice? Right? First of all, I didn't want to file a lawsuit. That's the worst part of this. I was that was my very last resort. I just wanted behavior to stop.
Right.
And if that's the message to women, that if you speak up, you're going to be retaliated against. I actually have a podcast called Retaliation. Specifically focuses on this issue. Because it doesn't matter if you're a high-profile consultant or in politics, or you're a high-profile TV host, as I was, or you're, a court reporter, which I'm a woman I'm interviewing, or a Harvey Weinstein survivor, or it doesn't matter. I interviewed a woman who was the chief marketing officer for United Way, the largest charity in the world. Anybody who raises their hand about harassment is automatically deprived of his or her job. And that person, the woman, is retaliated against. The perpetrator gets to keep working. I mean, think about that paradigm. That's what we need to change. That's exactly what needs to be changed. Why should you be the only African-American guy in the room? Well, you know why? Because I suspect a lot of people in your position just said, we don't really want to be in this kind of situation anymore. We just don't want to deal with the racism.
Right. It's true.
And so when you have, especially in politics, when you have a government that is where women get pushed out, where people of color get pushed out, where members of the LGBTQ community get pushed out, you end up with a government by white men for white men. And then we wonder why abortion is suddenly banned.
There you go.
Right?
And it comes full circle.
Making the decision. The guys that push guys like you out and women like me out. I mean, that's not what it should be like. And again, rather than telling you, Michael Steele, hey, why don't you suck it up? Or telling me, Julie Roginsky, hey, why don't you suck it up? Why don't they just cut it out?
There you go.
And be more inclusive. And that's all that needs to happen in politics. That needs to happen from politics to the bodega, my street corner in New York. That needs to happen across the board.
Well, I'm glad to see that you are out there lending your voice to making it happen and calling it out. There are a lot of women and people of color, LGBTQ individuals who will benefit from your voice in this space. Folks, you got to check out the work that Julie's doing. You can do so. Visit Lift Our Voices at liftourvoices.org. That's her nonprofit that's working in this space to create a safe space, an opportunity for those voices to be heard. And check out her podcast, Retaliation with Julie Roginsky. It's a great opportunity, again, to be connected into the conversation. Julie, I appreciate you taking time and coming on and sharing good, strong, smart words for my listeners, and I hope they take it all to heart. Follow Julie also on Twitter at Julie Roginsky, and again, check out Lift Our Voices and Retaliation at the podcast. So Julie, until next time, take care of yourself. And the rest of y'all out there, behave yourselves. You got to vote now, because look, I just put it straight up. If you don't vote this November, don't bother conversating with me. All right. Because if you're not taking your civic responsibilities seriously, then you're not ready for what's about to happen. So you guys have got to get out there, get yourselves registered. If you aren't registered, check out what the rules are in your backyard. If you want to do that, go to us.vote or usvotefoundation.org. Get all the information you need to empower yourself to push these bastards out who are trying their best to curtail our rights. All right, so that's your mission. Until next time, take care.